Great, thank you. It's such an honor to be here to join you from halfway around the world. And I want to begin. I have a PowerPoint which could be started now. Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk you through some core ideas in this book, Living Well Now and in the Future, which I wrote with my co-author, geologist co-author Ellen Metzger. This book was many years in development. The origins of it came with an invitation to write a policy booklet about the UNESCO Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. That decade was announced for 2005 through 2014. I gave a keynote lecture in Oxford. There was an education policy booklet series. Editor of that series was there and asked me if I would expand it into a booklet. And so that booklet was launched with a debate with a number of commentators in London in 2009. So still in the first half of that decade. Two of the commentators had just come from the UNESCO, the Decade Midway Conference in Germany. One of them was the director of the decade implementation in Britain. And so I hope you've all heard of that decade. Many people in the United States had not. The point of it was to try to advance education and sustainability and sustainable development around the world over the course of a decade. And I think that work, at least the people in Britain who read it, thought that it would have some impact in Britain, and I wanted to try to broaden the reach of it. And so I invited the geologist collaborator who runs a San Francisco Bay Area Institute for Earth and Environmental Studies. She develops curricula, trains teachers in teaching Earth systems, science, and ethics. I brought her on because she knows the curricular side of this better than I do, and she works directly with teachers in a way that's had a lot of impact. It's come with a lot of funding from NASA climate education projects. So this book was the culmination of expanding that 2009 booklet for a wider audience. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Great. And so shortly after its publication, the Beijing Normal University Press began translating it into Chinese. And I include this just to make the point that there are ongoing efforts around the world, as I'm sure you all know, to try to improve the measures of social progress. And China is a very interesting case because the Chinese central government measures the performance of regional and local leaders strictly on economic growth. And of course, national policy does not really match up with that. There are certainly efforts towards sustainability in China, but the official measures are strictly economic. And I think everyone who thinks about sustainability knows that that's extremely unfortunate to only be looking at economic growth. It's not a good measure of how well people are living. The idea of sustainable development is to enable people to live well while preserving opportunity to live well in the future. So this translation appeared in May, excuse me. And I was asked to, the translation was one of half a dozen books about sustainability, which were all translated by the dean and colleagues in the School of Economics and Resource Development. And they engaged in these translations as part of a larger project to try to create what they're calling a China Genuine Progress Indicator, which would be a well-being and sustainability sensitive measure of social progress. And so there was a launch conference in May where I spoke, where the authors of the other 5 or 6 books spoke. So I don't know how this process will go, but that's another important area of development as well as education for this work. I think education is obviously absolutely fundamental, but there's a prospect, there's promise to be able to shift government policies, development policies, to be more sensitive to sustainability, and which I believe at the same time could also be more conducive to people actually living well, because as we all know, economic development alone can be fall short in some very important ways of enabling the broad public to live good lives. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So a central question for the book is, how do we conceptualize what sustainability is? At least in the United States, it's been very common for people to say sustainability is obviously important, and it has an obvious ethical content to it. The idea of sustainability suggests, it implies caring about the future, but many people will say it's very hard to define what sustainability is and very hard to define the ethical core of it. The Brundtland definition of sustainable development is widely used as a definition of sustainability, but it's not actually in itself a definition of sustainability. It uses the word sustainable as a qualifier on the word development. So sustainable development is a concept of the right way to go about development. It's not in itself a definition of sustainability. So I wrote this book trying to focus on the ethical dimensions of the concept of sustainability. So let's go to the next slide, please. So unsustainability, I think, is a term that qualifies or refers to an aspect of human activities. So we're living unsustainably if we're putting, if human activities in the aggregate are putting burdens on nature that will degrade the capacity of natural systems to support such activities, human activities in the future. So it's unsustainability is about how we are living in the aggregate. And I think the ethical heart of sustainability is the quality and quantity of opportunities for us to live well in the future. I think it's not always put this way, but I think that's the obvious way to put it. It's the obvious intent of the idea of sustainability, which is a fairly recent invention, of course. So this book is an effort to make a little bit more precise in an ethically helpful way what the ethical core of the concept of unsustainability and sustainability is. So it's about preserving opportunities to live well in the future. And I want to make the point that preservation is different from saying what the Brundtland definition says. The Brundtland definition says that sustainable development is about meeting current needs while allowing people in the future to meet their needs. We could imagine a world where we have more than enough now of consumption and impact on the world for us to be doing better than meeting our needs now. And so there's a sense in which setting the baseline in the future as simply meeting needs could permit, in principle, it would permit us to be living now in a way that where we, in the aggregate, have better opportunities to live well than we would be allowing people in the future to have. So the concept of needs sets a baseline of adequacy. It doesn't ensure, as it were, equality of opportunity to live well over time, or, and I think the word preservation of opportunity to live well implies a kind of equality. So we want to be living in a way now which is not diminishing opportunities to live well in the future. But that's the core ethical idea. So we go to the next slide then. So how do we conceptualize preservation of opportunity to live well over time? And it turns out to be philosophically an interesting question. So if you look at the way we typically conceptualize equal opportunity for the present, it's usually in terms of thinking, well, there's some big pool of occupations. Much of the opportunity to live well flows to people through their opportunity for good employment. And so we think the key important thing is to ensure equal chances or a fair competition for the occupations there are. So notice two things. That doesn't give us any assurance that the occupations will support opportunities to live well. It relies on the notion that if you have a free market in occupational opportunities, then the market pressures will put pressure on employers and potential employers to make the work attractive and make it such as to support opportunities to live well. But the key point is that occupations change all the time. And the more rapid our technological development is, supported by our growing educational systems, the more rapidly the occupations change. And so over time, even over a couple decades, the pool of occupations changes. And so you can't conceptualize equality of opportunity to live well over time as a fair competition for people all competing for the same occupations. Over time, there just isn't any significance to the idea of the same occupations. They're not the same, they change. So because there's no common pool of occupations over time, I argue that we really have to focus not on these external stepping stones in the form of occupations to live well. We have to focus on what's actually inherent in living well. And that's been resisted in public policy in many countries because it seems we would have to make some judgment about what's objectively essential to living well. And much of the late 20th century public policy was predicated on the idea that everyone knows best what they want and what will make them happy. And so we just need open markets and freedoms, and we'll have the best possible outcome, everyone just pursuing opportunities in whatever they think will make them happy. So there's been a subjectivism that's driven public policy. And it's connected with the idea that, well, all we can really do as societies is to try to promote economic growth. because economic growth is equated with increasing opportunities to live well, leaving people completely free, as long as they're not violating other people's rights for how to do that. So, but arguing that to conceptualize preservation of opportunity over time, we have to focus on what's inherent in living well, forces us to try to grapple with what we can know, what we do know objectively about what's inherent in living well, so that we can focus our policy in trying to make sure people have what they actually need to live well, as opposed to what our markets may be trying to persuade people that they should want. So let's go to the next slide. So very little on this slide. So here's the huge question, right? So what is living well? So I'll now try to answer that. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to go to, so there are many traditions. The one that I've spent a lot of my career trying to understand is ancient Greek philosophy. We have this Greek term eudaimonia, which we translate as living well or flourishing. And the concept of eudaimonia is roughly that there are certain kinds of activities that are both rewarding and pleasant for human beings, and also worthy of admiration or objectively creditworthy. And so if you ask parents, what do you want for your children? We know many parents will say, I just want my child to be happy. But I don't actually think that's true. I think we want our children to have good lives. We want them to live well. And that when you scratch below the surface, that everyone understands this is in a twofold sense. We want our children to live lives that are worthy of respect and admiration, and we want them to take pleasure and satisfaction in those lives. I think when we eulogize people at the end of their lives, you can hear an irresistible pull towards that same twofold sense of what constitutes a good life. When someone dies, we grope for what we can say about what was admirable in the way they lived their lives, and we search for things to say that signify that they found that life personally rewarding and found satisfaction in it. So I think the idea of living well and of preserving opportunity to live well, we have to understand that it's an ethically twofold concept that we're aiming at, and this is what people want for themselves. They want for their children, if they're not sociopaths. Next slide, please. So that's the concept of eudaimonia, a living well. There's another aspect to it, which is the idea of human potential and fulfilling that potential well. And what I just described was what's often called the Aristotelian hypothesis, the idea that there's some natural connection or convergence that grows out of human nature for there to be kinds of activities that are both personally rewarding and admirable. And so this is adding now, and those admirable and pleasant forms of activities are ones in which we're fulfilling our human potential well. So next slide, please. So the question then is, can this Aristotelian hypothesis, this this ancient hypothesis, which I think is common in ancient traditions, far beyond the ancient Greek world. Can it be vindicated? Is it true? Right. So this concept of eudaimonia is only helpful to us in understanding the enterprise of preserving opportunity to live well over time if we have some evidence that this hypothesis is true. And so the next slide takes us to self-determination theory. So I've been collaborating with the founders of self-determination theory for about 12 years now. Rich Ryan and Ed Deasy. Many people know their names in connection with the concept of intrinsic motivation. But over the past 50 years, they've developed this huge body of psychological theory and research. The work is going on with over 500 global collaborators in 39 countries. And so the key findings that are important to understanding eudaimonia have been cross-culturally validated, replicated in at least 39 countries now. And so the key finding in it, so basic psychological needs theory, they call it mini theory, and it's the most important part of self-determination theory itself, this larger theory. The key finding that's been replicated in many hundreds of studies now is that no one in the world seems to perceive their life as going well unless all three of the basic psychological needs are satisfied. So basic psychological needs theory identifies three basic psychological needs. A very elaborate body of tests for determining whether something will qualify as an independently significant basic psychological need within this framework. But the three needs are essentially that people be positively related to others, which means not just that we have some good relationships, but that we experience ourselves as part of a harmonious social world. Each encounter we have with individual others, or as we're embedded in a larger group, we know that mutual affirmation of each other's value has an immediate and very important impact on our well-being. When we are generous, when we're kind and compassionate, even if it's not reciprocated, we get a big boost in our sense of well-being. The opposite has the opposite effect. So there's independent significance for fulfillment of these needs and for frustration of them. And any frustration in experiencing conflict or us not affirming other people's value or vice versa, it has significance. Second need is the need for competence, which means to experience ourselves as capable, able to manage our circumstances, able to do things well. Nobody in the world seems to be happy unless they're experiencing themselves as competent most of the time. These two needs are very, very widely recognized and very, very important, even independently of self-determination theory in learning theory and pedagogical practice. The third need, which self-determination theory researchers introduced and have shown is equally just as important as these other two, is the need to be self-determining or autonomous. Now, this doesn't mean to be independent, to make all your decisions for yourself, It means experiencing yourself as self-determining or autonomous means that we are able to act in ways that align with our values and goals. So self-determination theory gives us a huge body of work that shows how these three needs, their satisfaction and frustration, regulate the uptake of values, the uptake of goals, the formation of a coherent self that coherently values and prioritizes different things and pursues goals with energy. So thank you. It's a good time for that slide. So, so those are the three needs. And we've distinguished three different forms of potential. So we've talked so far just about fulfilling potential well, but we can distinguish intellectual, social, and productive potential. This is helpful in seeing that the relationship between fulfilling potential and satisfying needs runs through forms of human excellence. So no one can reliably experience positive relatedness unless they possess virtues of character, right? The virtues of character that give us dispositions to treat other people in respectful and supportive ways, lead us to treat other people in ways that affirm their value. Similarly, we can't reliably experience ourselves as competent unless we have actual capabilities that we have developed, and so in both cases, education is critical. And third, we can't experience ourselves as self-determining without some success in making good decisions for ourselves. So that's one form of fulfillment of intellectual potential, is in having the intellectual virtues and the understanding of the world that allows us to actually make good decisions. So what we can see from SDT research and many, many hundreds of studies, replication of results across the world in many different countries and cultures, is that the Aristotelian hypothesis actually seems to be right, that there are forms of activities that are socially constructive, that are competent and producing displaying forms of excellence in the world, and in guiding our actions in an intelligent way. We cannot satisfy these basic needs and cannot be happy unless we satisfy all of these basic needs, unless we are embodying these different forms of intellectual and character virtues and forms of excellence, productive or creative excellence. So next slide, please. So the basic principle I come to then, relying on this idea of eudaimonia and relying on self-determination theory to try to vindicate the empirical claim at the heart of the idea of eudaimonia, is a preservation of opportunity principle, that the individuals of future generations should have prospects of living well that are as good on average as those of individuals alive now, regardless of when they're born. And so how do we do that? So the educational point, the first one, is that we need to distinguish internal necessities for living well, people's developed attributes that education is essential to promoting, namely the understanding, the virtues of character and intellect, and the capabilities that people have to possess in order to live well. But then also, importantly, we're not going to secure people's ability to live well just by having them possess those attributes. We have to ensure that the context of people's lives, the way their activities are shaped by the institutions in which they're operating, the institutions that shape the decisions they make. We have to be sure that those institutional contexts of people's lives actually permit them to display these attributes. That is, we can have wonderful intellectual and character virtues and capabilities, and we can be thwarted in our attempts to live well by institutions whose expectations do not align with us engaging in the kinds of activities that fulfill our potential well. So we may have terms of employment that demand that we treat other people in ways that will cause us immense personal pain if we're good people. They may pit us against other people in trying to maximize profits without much regard for the people, the clients we're dealing with. We're losing in the United States, we're losing countless teachers, not because they've burned out, but because they're demoralized. The ways schools are being structured and managed and the way teachers' work is being measured leaves many of them feeling that they're not able to actually give students what they need. And they feel that their own activities of teaching are being warped and that they're being blocked and thwarted in trying to actually give children what they need. So that would be an example. We need our schools, we need every other institution to be aligned with people in work and in other avenues of life being able to actually manifest the forms of activities in which they can experience themselves as fulfilling their potential. So that's crucial. So next slide, and that's the last one. So how can we measure progress toward living well? So start where I just ended. First question, are the institutions that shape our activities conducive to sustainability? Actually, that wasn't where I just was, forgive me. So the activities in which we engage in, I said at the beginning, are in the aggregate. We add up all the human activities we engage in. They add up to unsustainability. The burdens they're putting on Earth systems are damaging and degrading the capacity of those systems. We can't focus very much on individual choices and not recognize that most of the choices that people make are powerfully shaped by many aspects of the society. They're shaped by policies, including economic development policies. They're shaped by the structures of cities, the options we have for how to get around, for how to stay warm. So it's a critical question how the institutions, policies, the built footprints of cities shape our activities. So the first question is, are all of those things aligned with or conducive to sustainability? The second, and this was where I was just now, are these institutions need supportive? Are they designed to enable people to meet their basic psychological needs and experience their lives as going well? That's critical, right? So we can also just use independent measures of wellness and subjective well-being. We use them broadly in surveying publics as another measure of whether our societies are moving in the direction of actually enabling people to live well. We know from self-determination theory research, there's a very strong alignment between subjective well-being and many other measures of wellness, including the amount of stress people experience in their lives, headaches, how well they sleep, and so on. So do we see progress in life satisfaction? And then finally, we need good measures of the health and stability of the planetary systems on which we all fundamentally rely. So I've probably expended my time, so I'll stop there. I thank you all warmly for welcoming me to this conference. Thank you.